and now I research the digital space. It's always really embarrassing to me to have technical problems. But anyway, thank you so much for the invitation, and it's such a pleasure to be here because there's so many people in this room who I already know, or else whose work I've read, and who've been really influential to my thinking in this area. This is research that I'm coming back to, actually. I'm currently researching social media and human rights and that space. But that had come out of this project, which was about human rights reporting at Mexican newspapers, because I was seeing social media enter that space. But so this is me coming back to an aspect of my research from that time. You know, with ethnographies, you end up always having tons of extra data, right? And I've heard said that you only need 3 ethnographies for a career's worth of work. And I don't know if that's true, but this is me coming back to some data that I always wanted to do something with, and I hadn't done anything with, and sort of seeing where it takes us. So this is a bit work in progress. And so I'd love to get your feedback at the end in terms of what you think I should be connecting with theoretically, or what you think is going on in my case. Okay, so the idea here is thinking about democratic journalism in authoritarian contexts. And, you know, we did just have this discussion about norms and research, and I didn't put this in just in the break. I actually wanted to just be very clear here that I'm coming from this normative position that journalism can support democracy and democratization. And I'm interested in my research connecting with practice and sort of feeding back into practice and having a dialogue there. And so specifically what I'm interested in looking at, or sort of how I'm interested in thinking about democratic journalism, is in its enablement of pluralism, as in the range of voices in the public sphere, the variety of voices and the number of voices, and also the pursuit of accountability, or holding actors, holding power to account on various issues. And I do that through looking at human rights reporting. And I see human rights reporting as a bellwether for democratic journalism and these characteristics in particular. This is for 2 reasons. One is because human rights reporting by its very nature draws on voices from civil society and from civilians, who are the subjects and the witnesses of violations. And obviously it's all about well, not all, but a large part of it is about accountability, holding the state to account on a particular aspect of democracy, its adherence to human rights principles. And a key part of the human rights mechanism as it works as a whole is the concept, which is known somewhat controversially as naming and shaming, but this idea of generating public moral outrage in order to impel change in the person who's accused of the violations, or the entity accused of the violations. And obviously this is done through the media, or the main channel is through the media. Okay, so I was looking at regional newspapers in Mexico in this particular piece of work. I was looking at Chiapas and Oaxaca, and I was really looking at understanding the influences, but even sort of more concretely, the sort of problems and the possibilities of democratic journalism as practice in this authoritarian context. And when I say authoritarian context, I'm talking, I know many of you in this room are quite familiar with Mexico and the media in Mexico, but for those who aren't, I'm talking about the type of authoritarianism that's particular to Mexico, in which political power is maintained as much with co-optation as coercion. And in the case of the media, with a long tradition of exchanging cash for coverage. At the time of my research, though, this tradition had been seriously unsettled, as not only had elements of the media broken with it, but also the long-standing semi-authoritarian party state had been ousted. Of course, they're back in power now. That party's back in power now. But at the time, they weren't in power at the national level. This transition was uneven, though. And journalists practicing in Oaxaca and Chiapas, the southern states of Mexico that I'm going to talk about, were working in the context of what Lawson has referred to as authoritarian enclaves. So there were regional governments in place in which actors still related to their citizenry, often as in the heyday of the PRI. And media institutions existed in which owners, editors, and journalists continued to see their outlets and their professions as sort of cash cows, right, that were could generate, that were quite lucrative, well, for the owners, perhaps, and not so much for the reporters, but they were lucrative because of financial informational contracts with government officials. So the data that I'm drawing on here forms part of a larger media ethnography I did of human rights reporting at Mexican newspapers in 2006. And what I include here are data from face-to-face, semi-structured interviews I conducted with 7 journalists in Chiapas and 6 journalists in Oaxaca. And among those, I interviewed at least 1 reporter or editor involved in human rights coverage from each of the 3 biggest regional newspapers serving those states, namely Cuarto Poder, Diario de Chiapas, El Heraldo de Chiapas, these are in Chiapas, and El Imparcial de Oaxaca, Tiempo de Oaxaca, and Noticias de Oaxaca in Oaxaca. I also visited newsrooms and spoke interviewed regional human rights sources. So in some respects, these states have similarities. They're in the south of Mexico, they're both relatively poor. They've both been the sites of significant social unrest. In Chiapas, there have been ongoing disagreements between the large indigenous population and the landholding and political elites that have contributed to the rise of the Zapatista movement and the militarization in some aspects of the state. In Oaxaca, which is where this picture is from, at the time of my visit, the government was embroiled in a tense and violent standoff with a kind of cobbled together opposition, which was seeded by a teacher's strike. The center of Oaxaca City, a key touristic space, was effectively shut down, with streets barricaded with corrugated iron, and members of the opposition movement camped out under tarpaulins, which you can see here. And newspapers had taken sides in this conflict. And here you see, these are the sort of allies of the teachers' strike, and they're reading Noticias de Oaxaca, which was the newspaper that had sided with their side of the situation. Because newspapers had taken sides, they were also targets, sort of physical targets in this situation, right? So, a few days after I was there, someone went into the newsroom of Noticias and shot a gun in the air, and the director thinks that this attack was revenge for a front page story which featured a movement calling for the governor to step down. So, the media is very political in these locations. And what I was interested in was the complexity, the kind of lived experience of journalists operating in these contexts, and this interplay between belief and behavior, between agency and structure, between journalistic norms and economic goals, between the state and the market. And I wanted to know about this kind of balance in terms of publishing without perishing. So the balance between not perishing financially, both with the journalists and with the newspapers themselves, not perishing physically, not putting yourself in a situation where you might face physical retaliation, and also not letting democratic journalism perish. So this terrain is very complex, and here I'm just trying to tease out a few of my findings that I think shed light on how this kind of journalism can operate in this kind of context. And what I'm going to do is put forth 2 predominant models of journalism as practiced in Oaxaca and Chiapas: mercenary journalism and market journalism. So mercenary journalism, which is what the words, that sort of label that one reporter gave to me about the kind of journalism that his newspaper did. This was a tradition, and a highly stable one, in terms of the relationship between the state and the media in Chiapas and Oaxaca. In Chiapas, the governor's spending kept far more newspapers afloat than the state's high illiteracy levels would naturally support. Traditionally, newspaper owners saw their ventures, like I said, as cash cows, and according to a reporter from Chiapas, they, quote, care more about publicity than information. For this reason, a newspaper director in Oaxaca told me, "Rich owner, poor newspaper" is a catchphrase in his state. Owners' incomes depended largely on these individualistic contracts with political figures who were wealthy enough to pay. And these contracts required informational protection for the paying entity, usually the governor and his office, rather than the party or the government as a whole. As a reporter in Chiapas explained it to me, here the issue is that there are unwritten pacts that you have to take care of, or the paper needs to take care of with the governor. The rest don't matter. If you say something about a minor functionary, it doesn't matter. It's published. It's the governor, the figure, like an emblem. And And these financial informational exchanges came in a variety of guises. For example, you might have a fixed duration promise to print every press release emitted by a government agency as a news article, or you would allow them control of a section of the newspaper. As a reporter in Chiapas described it, the newspaper owners don't care about selling their top story. Here, everything is sold. If you want to buy an editorial, they sell it. In journalism, there are things that should be untouchable, that only the owners or those responsible for the newspaper should decide what should be published. One of those things is the editorial, which is where the policy of the business, how it sees things should go. The other is a top story, the ocho columnas. And for those of you who don't know, that is a way to refer to the sort of the headline story because it would spread across all 8 columns on the front page. Here, the top story, the ocho columnas, is sold every day. So the PACs also extended to the suppression of negative coverage. A newspaper director in Oaxaca told me, quote, newspapers say to the government, look, we didn't publish, here's our bill. They also struck at the reporter level. And journalists told me that traditionally an employment contract with the newspaper was, in effect, a credential sanctioning financial informational opportunism. Reporters, therefore, have traditionally been very poorly paid in Oaxaca and Chiapas. Accordingly, as a newspaper director from Oaxaca told me, when you see a journalist with jewels, you know something's going on. Everyone corrupts them. You pay off journalists if you have a car crash so they don't cover it. To kill a big toad, you need a big stone. Just as an aside, this is why I love interviewing journalists, is they always have the most amazing ways of describing, sort of pithy soundbite ways of describing things. Okay, so at mercenary newspapers, in the words of a reporter at El Heraldo, the Chiapas, quote, the economic vision supersedes the journalistic vision. When I asked her what her newspaper's editorial line was, she replied, to tell you the truth, I don't know. I don't know because the informational leaning, the journalistic leaning, is not defined here. The interests change according to the economic situation. So given this kind of structured relationship between the state and the media, it would seem surprising that you would see human rights reporting at this type of newspaper, at mercenary newspapers. But the thing is, because in this mercenary journalism, information is valued for the money it can bring in rather than for its journalistic content, this can go one of 2 ways for accountability journalism or democratic journalism like human rights reporting. And it depends on the strategizing of reporters who decide that they want to adhere to a kind of democratic journalistic project in the context of a newspaper leadership that does not. And among my interviewees and their peers, these journalists, the ones who held these democratic norms close to their hearts, tended to be of a different generation from the leadership. As here in the UK, there was a tradition of sort of fresh university graduates with degrees in journalism who had gotten jobs at regional newspapers as a way to kind of lose their training wheels. And they had their sights set on moving on to bigger national newspapers. But they saw themselves as very much in conflict with the existing kind of editorial and ownership structure. Old dogs don't learn new tricks, one reporter from El Heraldo de Chiapas said about her superiors. Her newspaper, she said, has, quote, a very closed vision of how it should be. She and her like-minded colleagues have had limited success in negotiating with the leadership about their journalism. She provided the example of a clash between farmers and peasants and their coverage of this. So she said, obviously the government always says that it acted in the correct manner, that it was time to evict them, that there were not any human rights violations, when in actuality there are wounded people, old people beating up children. You put that in the article, but the title will end up being, the government applies the rule of law. This is very common. So you can see that there is restricted autonomy in practicing democratic journalism, except where these journalists have complete autonomy, which I'll explain. These reporters, in terms of human rights in particular, were very alive to it in a way that their superiors were not. Any consciousness of human rights as a concept, this same reporter said to me, was, quote, coming from the reporters towards the higher ups, not from the directors to us. Obviously, they knew their success in publishing articles accusing the paying members of government and their cronies would be negligible. A Diario de Chiapas reporter told me that when he was hired, he was told, quote, which people I couldn't touch or attack. But these reporters had developed a variety of strategies for getting human rights information into the public sphere on their own terms. One set of strategies involved working within the confines of their newsroom, while another set involved circumnavigating their newsrooms altogether. In terms of working within the newsroom, this comes back to the way that information is valued financially. If the information is relevant to paying politicians, it's valued for its content. If it's not relevant to politicians, it's valued for its length. So besides assignments, these reporters did have assignments, and they were sort of assignments around these cash for coverage articles and restrictions related to paying politicians. So, but besides those, reporters told me they had a lot of freedom to write about whatever they chose. One said to me, quote, they accept human rights articles when we bring them. There's no problem. They give us space, but it's not a priority. Given this lack of priority, these articles' positions are not assured should more lucrative information cross an editor's desk. And one reporter told me that since he doesn't get assignments, he takes this opportunity of autonomy, which is perhaps more autonomy than he might have at a larger newspaper in Mexico City. But he takes this opportunity of autonomy to cover the human rights situation of vulnerable people like street children and women. As another reporter from El Heraldo explained it, the longer this type of article, the better. He says, there's no space problem. I determine what size the article is. According to the reasoning of the directors, if the article is bigger, they give it more space, although there might be something more important that's smaller. We call these articles chorizos because they're very long. So, these were valuable because they filled up space between the news that got them information, right? The Diario de Chiapas reporter, at times, what he did was reverse the traditional article pyramid for these types of stories, burying the lead below these kind of mild introductory paragraphs in the hopes that this would make it even more likely to get past the newsroom censors. The reporters thus took advantage of the fact that editors are looking for content to fill the space around ads and paid articles to publish news that fit their own personal views about what their role was in terms of democratic journalism. And these reporters, of course, encountered information that they wanted to publish, but they knew their newspapers would not cover. The reporter from Diario de Chiapas said that in those cases, what he would do is pass along the information to a colleague at another newspaper who had a better chance of publishing it. And I spoke with a reporter who used to be a regional correspondent for the national news magazine Proceso. He told me he used to get lots of exclusive articles this way because Proceso is a news magazine in Mexico City. It publishes a lot of critical content. And he said this kind of trade in information that couldn't be published, quote, was very good for me and very good for Proceso. And then another alternative space that was emerging at that time was blogs. So here's, this was on a wall in Oaxaca, a blog spot, and in Chiapas, there's a whole bunch of blogs that were networks. All the journalists sort of knew each other and they would link to each other online. So that was another space. However, we know that digital spaces are imperiling journalists in Mexico as around the world. And that was not the only precaution or sort of aspect that journalists had to be careful about. When I was in Chiapas, the journalists were telling me about what they called the ley mordaza, so the gag law. And this was the government's penal code reforms in 2004, which increased the criminal penalties for defamation and libel. So you could go to jail. It was very severe penalties. And it was sort of very easy to be put in jail on these charges. As a reporter for Diario de Chiapas explained it to me, quote, confronting such a large power is risky. There are a lot of people in jail, a lot of reporters, above all because the newspaper doesn't back you up. I have colleagues who've been taken to court and their newspapers don't help. As a reporter from El Heraldo de Chiapas put it, quote, there are many newspapers that prefer to sacrifice their correspondence than to lose advertisements. Okay, so turning now to the other form of journalism that I wanted to talk about, which is market journalism. And these market newspapers are not unrelated to their mercenary brethren. And basically, many of them had done either a voluntary transition from sort of being paid by state entities to being embedded in the market, or an involuntary transition. And I'll talk about this in turn. So in Oaxaca, two of the newspapers, El Imparcial and Tiempo, were taking tentative steps towards journalistic norms and towards market orientation. These transitions were driven by the vision of newspaper owners, who can be understood as what Hughes calls change agents. And journalistic norms were evident at these papers at both the leadership level and with the reporters. But economic goals were present too, and these newspapers were in steady pursuit of the market for readers and therefore advertisers. And these newspapers had found that human rights reporting was an excellent type of news for fulfilling their journalistic norms as well as for meeting their economic goals. The latter was because of several reasons, including that it met a reader demand for independent political information, as well as in its more gruesome manifestations for Nota Roja, which is the form of tabloid journalism in Mexico dedicated to covering violence. And the dual purpose was well illustrated by a vignette by the owner of Tiempo de Oaxaca outlined for me, which was the story of a local Taekwondo champion who was beaten by the police and taken to the jungle, and it was set up to look like a suicide when he died. It went to court, they were convicted, and this newspaper followed it very, very carefully, very closely. And he had this dual rationale, which was, on the one hand, he said, we think there should not be authority abuses. We're living in a country where everyone has to respect the law, but those who first have to do it are those that want it to be obeyed. So I don't think it's an obligation of a paper, but any citizen, denounce these things and seek justice. So you see this sort of democratic aim of this coverage. But so his second rationale was about attracting readers through a credible demonstration of independence. He said, also, we're a paper that aspires to credibility, to higher circulation, that wants to gain the confidence of the people. This article brings credibility because it converts us into a trustworthy media. Tiempo tells the truth. Tiempo doesn't hide things. They say, well, Tiempo, they, as in the public audiences, well, Tiempo defends the interests of society. It's playing the role it was given as a paper, denouncing abuses so that they're solved, so that the authorities create order. So this gives us credibility. And the reporter who covers human rights for El Imparcial de Oaxaca confirmed this kind of reader thirst for this type of news, saying, quote, the violation of human rights is frequently among our articles, and the paper gives it space because it sells. People want to know. If someone was beaten, if their rights were violated, people want to know. Yes, it's news. And then, okay, that's sort of the voluntary transition from mercenary to market. And then you had the involuntary transition. And these were newspapers that had gotten into fights with the powers that be about one thing or another. And it was never entirely clear to me the sort of sequence of events of these fights, because I got different stories from every single person, which I think is telling in and of itself. These fights meant that these newspapers had adopted a critical stance to the government in power, including on human rights. As the director of Puerto Poder told me, quote, precisely because of our fight with the government, which he said was played out in part through this kind of coverage, his newspaper had developed this plurality of readers. The director of Noticias de Oaxaca said, quote, denunciations sell a lot of newspapers. So like the voluntarily transitional newspapers who had gone to the market to help them pursue democratic journalism, these involuntarily transitional ones had discovered they could tap into a public hungry for independent news, and therefore were using democratic journalism to survive in the market. So as a reporter at El Heraldo de Chiapas explained it, this coverage of involuntary transitional newspapers opposed the state government, quote, because they cut all their money. Oops, I meant to, there we go. Because they cut all their money, not because they're playing the martyr of their freedom of expression. Thanks. But the news kind of coverage was a bit similar, okay? The attractiveness of this accountability journalism, which was born of vengeance and fueled by reader demands, may actually be laying the groundwork for the spread of journalistic norms. As the director of Cuarto Poder said, the newspaper is open to any kind of denunciations. Oh, sorry. There we go. There we go. Okay. Like lack of security, water, of any service provided by the government. His reporter described the editorial line as putting out the information that other newspapers do not, giving voice to those who don't have it, telling the truth about the government, putting things out how they are. And the same sentiments were evident in Noticias de Oaxaca, where the director told me, now the paper is committed to the people. So these journalistic norms were no doubt welcomed by any reporters at these newspapers who adhered to them as a result of their training, the sort of second generation. And the reporter from Cuarto Poder told me his newspaper's group of young journalists were helping it, quote, walk against the current. So, you know, it had sort of positive implications for the future. Limits of this market journalism. So even if these market newspapers do have much greater independence from the state, their market advertisers had learned some tips and tricks from the tradition of the financial informational contracts. And the reporter at Tiempo told me she had not even broached the topic in terms of the teacher conflict about the teachers' rights being violated by the state, because she knew it wouldn't be published. Any information that might seem to support the justification or the perpetuation of the conflict was against the tourism industry's interests. She said, however, I can talk about how there is discrimination against children with AIDS, that the indigenous are treated badly. In other words, I can exploit anything I want about human rights, except for right now, this topic. Okay, that's the overview, and I'm moving towards sort of getting this sort of theoretical frame, and I wanted to advance three conclusions or three implications that I think we can draw from what I've put forth. The first is, and again, this is thinking about the problems and the possibility of democratic journalism. This notion of being somewhere between the state and the market. Thinking about problems, as Karan points out, there's a dichotomy between this kind of liberal perspective that sees state control as the main problem, with market-funded journalism as a solution, and the critical perspective that also sees the market as extremely problematic for democratic journalism. But as the cases I've outlined show, and in line with what there's a number of you in the room who've written about this, I know Dan, Helen, and Mireya, you've both sort of looked at this in Mexico. People have looked at it in China and in the UK as well. There's this idea that let's get rid of this dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy. It's not about which perspective is right, but which perspective is right when. Both perspectives clearly are useful for understanding journalism in Oaxaca and Chiapas. Clearly, the market's helping newspapers get out from under state control. At the same time, it's raising all kinds of new problems. It's sort of a frying pan fire situation. We can see this with those private advertisers. We can see this with the emphasis on Nota Roja at the exclusion of other kinds of human rights coverage. We can see this with the question of the longevity of democratic journalism at these involuntarily transitional newspapers. And this was expressed by a reporter at Cuarto Poder. Said to me, right now, one could say that his newspaper is La Jornada of Chiapas. La Jornada is a national newspaper that's been quite critical of the state. For now, it's a position on the left, on attack, always against the government. And then I said, why do you say for now? He said, I said for now, because I don't know what's going to happen after this government leaves. If the paper is going to reach an agreement with the next one, I have to tell you the truth. I don't know what agreements it will reach if one party wins or another. So a second area for thinking further is also thinking about beyond the state and the market. Because I think looking at the state and the market context isn't enough for understanding the problems and the possibilities of democratic journalism here. If we only looked at the market and state context, the structure, we might be overly pessimistic about human rights reporting, the sort of possibilities in Mexico, because we are overlooking the agency and the norms of the individual reporters and their strategies of resistance. And an example of how important this can be, and I think this is where this research resonates in some ways with the kind of de-Westernizing of communication studies, which Silvio Weisbord has written about and others have written about, which is sort of a contrast, like thinking about this chorizo, right? Okay, I'm almost finished. Oops. sorry, the computer thing on. And just a quick quote, which was from McManus' study of TV news in the US, where he talks about this hamburger helper quadrant, which is very similar to the chorizo quadrant, or chorizo category that the journalist I spoke to was talking about. And he says, this kind of category of information has no journalistic value. It represents filler, programming, extending material, etc. Do you know what hamburger helper is? Anyone? It's an American thing, I think. It's when you make a hamburger, there was this product on the market where you could add to your hamburger to make it a bigger hamburger, basically, that wasn't hamburger, it was really cheap, right? Just filler. So he's saying this news is just nothing, it's just filling space. Whereas if you look at the case that I found, this idea of chorizo was actually one of the biggest spaces for journalists who promote democracy to enter information that is democratic. So I think it's really important that we're looking at what the journalists are doing and the context as well. And the last point I want to make is a methodological one, thinking about methods for accessing behaviors and beliefs. So if we measure just in terms of behavior methodologically, we might be thinking about a content analysis of human rights reporting. It would give us a good snapshot of what's actually happening in terms of getting out into the public sphere, but it might lead us to be pessimistic as well. And this is because behavior doesn't necessarily map onto belief. And this is where my presentation resonates with what Sara was finding in Cuba, and also this bigger conversations around the gap between ideals and performance in journalism. And so to get at these beliefs, I think we need to be focusing always on interviews as well. Interviews, in the case of the involuntary market newspapers, without the interviews, we might be misled about the stability of democratic journalism there, because we wouldn't know that if those, that state situation changed, that there were not necessarily norms to sustain this kind of democratic project. At the same time, if we looked at the mercenary journalism, we wouldn't know that there was a lot of unexpressed democratic ardor, kind of fervor there that was just looking for a channel to get out. And so there was a lot of potential there. Okay, it's an understanding this kind of complex interplay of behaviors and beliefs, these norms and the economic goals, the agency and the structure, the state and the market, that we can move towards, and this is what I'm trying to do, this pragmatic scholarship that helps us not only understand, but also support the project of democratic journalism. Thank you.
Okay, so next up we have Dr. Mireya Márquez Ramírez. Sorry. Thank you. Dr. Ramírez is going to be talking about towards the development of a captured liberal model of media in Latin America. Thank you.
Ya se quedó. Ah, pero porque es que es, ok, entonces sí.
No hablamos también.
everybody, thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to see so much interest in the relationship between Latin American media. When I was studying in London, my PhD, there were very few of us compared to the number that I see nowadays, which means that Britain has more and more interest in Latin America, which is a region that normally doesn't get much attention in the Anglo-Saxon literature, despite the best efforts of Silvio and Jairo and Daniel and everyone else. And that's why, well, today I'm going to present some theoretical development that me and my colleague Manuel Alejandro Guerrero are doing, to give some sort of theoretical support to all the empirical research that a number of us have undertaken over the last years. That's why I'm glad that Ella has preceded me in presenting this wonderful research, because then it gives an empirical face to what I'm going to talk about here. Right, so here is the damn book. It's been damned everywhere. But one of the reasons why for theories of the press was so important on Z is because it developed a way of looking at media as extremely linked to political systems. So journalism does not occur in a vacuum, despite the best intentions of journalists and despite their ideals. That I think the main contribution of the book, despite all the shortcomings that it has, is to link the types of political systems with the type of media systems that we have today. Why is this important? Because in Latin America, every time there is a discussion about how the media should be, or what should media policies or media regulation should look like, it almost always comes to the very same distinctions that from many theoretical positions want to be overcome, but we still return to this. Essentially, in Europe, there is a discussion about public broadcasting, and the challenges to survive in the European Union. But in Latin America, where we have a big tradition of private media conglomerates, we have one of the biggest concentration indexes in the world, the discussion is about how to become more BBC and less Televisa, right? Whereas in Europe, I hear, and in Britain, is how to become more Fox News and less BBC. So it's like we have what each other has, and it's not a good side, at least for Latin America. So every time my students come to me and say, what kind of media shall we aspire to, we always come, to this distinction, which continues to be grounded in those old, obsolete theories of Siebert et al., which of course should be buried, but they refuse to die, Professor, for some reason. So, in a nutshell, we have this distinction between private model and state models of broadcasting and of media. And there are a number of advantages and disadvantages to that. In the underlying and the most notable difference is the property. And within the property, it's difficult to ascertain whether state models will end up being, handled by the government or unduly administered by harsh authoritarian governments wanting to take over the world, whereas with private models, we never can be really sure that the private interest and the public interest are aligned, quite the opposite. So in a way, my students always end up very pessimistic about which one of the two. Of course, I know the discussion is a lot more complicated than that, but we always, in every single media forum that we have in Mexico, end up having this conversation again, private or public. Right. So why am I mentioning that? Is because, as we know, Professor Halina and his colleague Paolo Mancini have developed this very famous book. I'm not going to go into that. Oh, and I apologize, some slides are in Spanish. I trust everyone speaks Spanish here. No? Yes?
Yes.
We're interested in the book, not so much because of the models, but because of the variables. The 4 variables that they propose are, quite interesting, and it really led us to play with them and to see what kind of dimensions and what kind of indicators and what kind of several variables can we attach to it. I think much of the criticism to the book has been addressed to the fact that the 3 models don't really fit the Western world. Whereas Manuel and I think that it's less about the models and more about the variables and how can we understand it in light of our own realities, both at the national and at the regional level. So why is this important? Because as you know, in Latin America, most of the scholarship, both the critical political economy and the counterpart to that, which is the more recent liberal approaches, tend to focus on what are the consequences of media concentration in the region. And the reason why critical political economy is so dominant is because there's probably no other area in the world in which so few players, have such a big share in the television market. And also, it might be one of the few regions in the world in which these media groups, had good relations both with the authoritarian regimes and with the democratic regimes. So since when one can be friends with God and with the devil? Not that anybody is God in this example, but it is interesting how the media always manage to mutate and to accommodate to the changing political circumstances and always get out stronger after. So one of the reasons we take Halina and Mancini's book as one of our guiding points is because we believe Mexico doesn't fit any of this model, obviously, but because we join the big wave of criticism to the liberal model, the liberal approach of thinking about the media that assumes that the government is the only source of censorship and control. Like all the power of the state is always a bad guy, whereas the market is a good guy. I know it's a kind of a very black and white picture, but in many of the assumptions that we read of scholarship, for example, assessing Soviet media, it always gives us the impression that anything Soviet, anything handled by the state is, naturally bad, whereas anything that is citizen-led oriented is naturally good, as if these are natural categories that we all possess, and it fails, to problematize the relationship between state and market and whether they are really, the 2 polars of a thing, or whether they are the same thing, as often happens in Latin America. So my colleague and I published this edited volume in which we kind of suggested the term liberal capture model, but we didn't fully develop it. That's what we are doing now. But this book we had, which is already published, it was published in October 2014. To be honest, we only wanted to update the literature on the region, and have local authors' rights on, and mostly from, their countries of origin. I mean, Silvio's book was published in 2002, Jairo's book was published in 2008, so it only seemed fair that we publish something 6 years later. Because if we compare this with China or with the Middle East, there is very, very little production about Latin America in the English language. And also, I think our Spanish-sounding names would give it a little, credibility, and our Latin accents and our misspellings in the book. We didn't really have a good editor, so might give it a little of credibility. Guerrero, Perez, Lopez, Matos. So we assorted, a combination of established and new emerging scholars to write about what does it, where these 10 countries are in terms of the market and of the states in relation to media policy, communication, media systems, and, the idea of globalization. So we want to challenge, and especially Silvio's chapter in the book challenges the overarching role of the global dimension as the only analytical dimension. So because the global is, a very catchy phrase in the context of the European Union, it doesn't mean it's everywhere else. So we problematize in the book the way that media system and issues of power have been categorized in literature. We analyzed, well, not we, my author colleagues, analyzed the role of the states, the markets, the political actors in shaping the media systems, policies, and journalism. And well, the book introduces this concept. I'm not saying we are the first one to use it in this context, but probably to apply to the Latin American context, because we believe that what explains, this ambiguity between what you call market and mercenary types of journalism is clientelism. Clientelism is a political culture, which is, the driver of negotiation, rather than the formal structure of legal frameworks. So whenever Manuel and I, would spend a couple of hours staring at the 4 variables, we would always say, something is missing here, but what is it? And we believe, even if we could categorize these dimensions into something tangible, we can't do it because there is the formal thing and then there is the actual thing. And the actual thing accounts for many of the ambiguities taking place in Latin America, and that something is culture. So we realized that we don't have culture here. Like how the formal arrangements materialize, or, in how the structure materializes in agency. We don't know what makes journalists professional, even if all the rules are there. Then how come still we can't have quality journalism? And then that's what we conclude, that the culture is the key, and the clientelism as political culture is the key. So these are the traits in common shared by 10 countries in Latin America. We discussed the 10 countries, and then we discussed something else that has nothing to do with that, but you'll see. What we do find in common is that Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, Chile, Peru, and Brazil, media elites and political power negotiate hierarchy and position and mutual arrangement. Regulation favors big players in exchange for favorable coverage, and at the core is and continues to be political advertisement. In contrast, Our book explores in some of the chapters how Argentina, Venezuela, and Bolivia are countries where we witness a resurgence of the state as a main driver of media policy. And apparently, these media policies and new, leyes de comunicación and all these things are good things because they are, trying to attack the big conglomerates and the big corporate power. But even if the law is good, is idealistic, aims to pluralism, what we and the authors find is that more often than not, these laws end up serving some private interest or end up being applied to, President Kirchner's enemies rather than everybody. So when you twist the laws in your favor, then that's capture. That's what in political science is called capture. So we see here what's the origin of the term capture. The certain groups affect the decision making of public policy and regulation in their favor, obviously at the expense of the general interest. And even if you have regulation, and even if you have the legal framework, if you have law institutional, and if you don't have institutional strength or rule of the law, then pragmatic exercise of power and arrangements end up taking place of the law. So what we did is we kind of joined our research findings, my colleague Manuel and I come more from a journalism studies background. My previous research had looked at how there were some pillars of authoritarian press-state relations in Mexico. If we can, as we can see, most of these pillars had to do or managed to permeate all the layers of the journalistic change. That means change, sorry, not change, change. It means there were payoffs and bribery to single journalists, but there was also control and handling of criticism and censorship and subsidy of newsprint. And the F is the most important because it also permeated the business model of media via the economic dependence of political advertisements. During, this authoritarian era in Mexico, which lasted 70 years, we could argue that we are still there. Thankfully, this is not a political science conference, otherwise we would be, debating here what's the proper concept to call it, neo-authoritarianism or dictatorship or dictatorland or whatever. But you know what I mean. It's not the type of authoritarianism that comes with a dictator, but it is an authoritarian democracy or something like that. So what I always found was that there was a contradiction between the school of thoughts. On the one hand, we have these liberal approaches to media democratization, which said that these things changed because of economic and political influences. So these quotes, the three quotes, kind of capture the liberal approach to media, to what they claim to be media professionalism, media democratization. And well, Wally says that by the end of the century, Mexican journalism became more assertive, investigative, politically engaged, and generally balanced. And then Rick Rockwell thought that Vicente's Fox victory in 2000 would bring a cataclysmic break with the past. And nothing like that really happened. There was no cataclysmic break, and much less with the past. Then, commercial competition between an emerging fourth state and Mexico's traditional media establishment encouraged diversity and independence in the press. So we have these very optimistic liberal approaches to media democratization in Mexico, And what is interesting is that they attribute that opening to commercialism, to competition, to the things that normally, the liberal tradition attributes to the market. Again, the market is a good thing, and the state is the devil. However, because of the very long critical tradition in Latin America, look how these titles kind of epitomize what Mexican scholars saw as the danger of media power. Primera plana, la borrachera democrática de los diarios means that the media were so happy being free that they forgot about equality. And then the Sexenio de Televisa, which kind of captures pretty much how Vicente Fox and Felipe Calderon's administrations had a type of relation with Televisa, which, as you know, is the biggest media corporation in the Hispanic world. And then Poderes Salvajes, Mediocracia sin Contrapesos. So how come these two sets of scholars have such a different approach to media change? For these scholars, Mexican journalism is much better than it used to be. But for these scholars, it's actually worse. So who is right? Who is wrong? Well, I actually tend to be with this line of thought. But I think Silvio gives us much more nuanced approach in his own study of South American journalism. He speaks about pragmatism. He speaks about, in this pragmatism, I really like how he described it, because it sheds light about how romantic some other accounts of change are, and how pragmatic Latin Americans have to be, because they lack the history of or a very strong type of model of journalism in Mexico. That's why what I found in my qualitative research in 2012 is that journalistic models are hybrid. So there is no either American or French tradition, because much of the scholarship is, it's always going back and forth about how American is your type of journalism vis-a-vis how French is your type of journalism, or how Soviet is your type of journalism. Well, here's what: Mexico has a little bit of everything for a variety of reasons. So there is no real clear model other than passive and disseminative kind of journalism for various reasons that would take another paper. I also found that values and professional norms of journalists are ambiguous and are also pragmatic. For example, these values, such as being a watchdog of the government, of objectivity and neutrality, as occurs with most of journalists around the world, tend to be normative, but they fail to materialize in practice. But not only that, I also found and confirmed with more recent research that they also endorse interventionist kind of roles and interpretative kind of roles. So things that in the literature have been theorized as separate, as an antagonist, coexist happily. I don't know if happily, but they coexist in Mexican journalistic culture. And that's why, for me at least, the concept of culture is quite important. And I'm going to explain why. Organizational logics, tend to favor short-term news rather than investigative journalism. Reporting practices and production routines tend to be passive, so officialismo prevails. And when there is criticism, it's always through third parties. My more recent research, which I undertook with Dr. Hughes and Márquez, 2015, we interviewed 3,078 journalists, and if you can see, the kind of journalistic roles they endorse belong to different categories in the literature. So watchdog, but they also like to be mobilizers, and they also like to be civic and loyal facilitator. In this case, help to promote peace and stability sounds like, very autocratic kind of thing. So I doubt that this kind of coexistence is so clear in other countries, as research has shown again and again. So what they say really contrasts with what is happening. I mean, look at how investigative journalism was present. It had a very low presence in a sample of 4,480 news items of the 5 main national newspapers. It's always less than 20%, and it's only La Jornada, this newspaper, which kind of scores highest in the good indicators of civic journalism. But because I tend to be more pessimistic than optimistic, I'd rather have you see this one. The third one, main source. Main source. These are the newspapers that Sally Hughes and Chapel Lawson attributed the most change. The liberal authors claim that these newspapers led change in Mexico and that they epitomize a civic kind of journalism, and I found none of it. On the contrary, Universal continues to be the most officialist of all the newspapers, despite being the most professionalized of newspapers. And cobertura unilateral means that even where there are more than one source, those kind of sources tend to give the same perspective, and 79.7% of all the stories in a 2-year sample, have this indicator. Okay, I'm not going too much into that. So what does it mean? Well, it means that culture matters, both political culture and journalistic culture. That maybe we have overlooked change. So Manuel Guerrero had his own modelo liberal capturado, but his model originally, which is included in the book, or only included these variables. So when Manuel meets Mireya, we produce this metaphor. Okay. So what Hallin and Mancini give us is, the metaphor of the fish bowl is the fish and the fish bowl. But what about the water? So we like to think we introduce this new dimension where the fish bowl is the system, the fish is journalism, the agent, and the culture is the water. So we are developing these 4 variables here, because we believe that, yes, the system goes down to the subject and the organization, but it needs to go through a cultural dimension. So we have a modelo autoritario, we have a model that went from authoritarian to what we now call modelo liberal capturado, in which some things change, but clientelism, low regulatory efficiency, unwritten rules, cooptation, dependency of political advertisement, all continue to shape media systems in a variety of ways. That doesn't mean there's no independent journalism or critical journalism. It's just that if critical journalism is just this dimension, then the change lies here rather in the whole thing. To really have substantial change, we not only need to change these rules, but the whole culture. Don't ask me how. We don't know how culture changes. I think we need to learn more about anthropology and rituals and all this, but clientelism continues to be the cornerstone of political and journalistic culture. Okay, well, those are the conclusions, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.